Well, welcome to you all. It's great to see such a large crowd here tonight. This is the 16th Roskill Memorial Lecture, and my first as master, so I'm working out what the traditions are. Looking back at it, it's proved a truly remarkable series. Over the years, the series has discussed NATO, the World Bank, China, India, the Middle East, Russia, the intelligence services, and climate change, to name but a few. Now, I know that Captain Stephen Roskill was known to many of you in the audience, but for those of you who didn't have that pleasure, and of course that includes myself, it's worth reminding ourselves that he was a career naval officer who served with bravery during the Second World War and was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for keeping his ship afloat after it was torpedoed. After the war, he carved out a second, equally successful career as the official historian of the Second World War at sea, and he was made a senior research fellow of this college in 1961. And it was in this role, over the course of the next 20 years, that he played such a key role in building up our Archives Centre. This lecture series is a fitting commemoration of a life lived through words and action. It wouldn't have been possible without Bill Barnett, who's in the audience tonight. As keeper of the Archives Centre, he came up with the concept for the lecture, and it certainly couldn't have been sustained without the support of the Roskill family. I believe we have 3 generations here tonight. I was told that there were some nephews and nieces scattered around, but I particularly want to welcome back Stephen's children, Nicholas and Claire, who are in the front. It's very fitting that we should continue to honour your father in this way. Tonight, the subject is Ireland, and we're honoured to have His Excellency, the Irish Ambassador, Dr. Daniel Mulhall, in the audience too. This year marks the centenary of the Easter Rising, and our Roskill lecture has been deliberately timed to coincide with a conference on the Rising in its global perspective, which is taking place here in College today and tomorrow. And I want to thank the organiser, Professor Eugenio Biagini, and to welcome all the speakers and delegates. And the conference also sees the launch of a book by Professor Biagini that he's edited along with Dr. Mulhall. I look forward to reading this. It's entitled The Shaping of Modern Ireland. And Alan's already mentioned the display of material from the archives that I hope some of you will have a chance to look at during the drinks reception, but without your drinks in hand. The presence of the conference attendees here tonight gives us a very large range of different perspectives on the Irish problem and a rather expert audience to strike fear into the heart of our speaker. And that brings me to Sir Roderic Lyne. We're very grateful to him for stepping in at comparatively short notice to deliver this lecture. It was a shock when Sir John Major announced he was having hip replacement surgery and had to drop out. Dame Norma, we ask you to wish him a full and speedy recovery. But Sir John was really helpful. He wrote and immediately suggested his own replacement, and I'm certain we couldn't have found anyone better. So let me tell you a bit about Sir Roderic. He entered the diplomatic service in 1970 and has never looked back. He served in Russia, Dakar, the UN and Geneva, and ended his career as ambassador to Moscow from 2000 to 2004. But during the period 1993 to 1996, he was on secondment as the foreign policy advisor to the Prime Minister and worked alongside John Major in the negotiations immediately before and after the Downing Street Declaration. And he's therefore uniquely well placed to reflect and comment on the genesis of the Northern Ireland peace process and the laying of the foundations for the current settlement. His role has not gone unnoticed. I've been referred to a work by Tim Pat Coogan, a well-known pro-Republican writer in Ireland, who mentions him in his book The Troubles, published in 1995. And there Coogan writes, Rod Lyne, and I quote exactly, Rod Lyne became a key figure in London's strategy. Lyne, once officially described as a secretary to John Major, came to be regarded by those in Dublin, Belfast and Washington who saw him in operation as deploying political rather than secretarial weaponry, and fairly heavy weaponry at that. Well, if nothing else, we have, I hope, at least spelt your name right tonight and not called you Lyne. And we hope that you will now deploy that same heavy weaponry for us. So, Sir Roderic.
Master, Your Excellency, dames, professors, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for that very kind introduction. In the sport of rugby, there's something called, I apologise for mentioning rugby to any of you of an Irish persuasion here after what happened at Twickenham last weekend, which we need not dwell on. But in the sport of rugby, there is something called a hospital pass. A hospital pass is when your teammate puts the ball in your hands just as a 19-stone forward from the opposition is about to crush you, and you end up in accident and emergency. Now, Sir John Major has devised a cunning variant on the hospital pass. He got himself into hospital first, and then he passed his ball to me, leaving me to talk about Ireland to an audience that is vastly more knowledgeable on the subject than I ever could be, an audience that includes His Excellency the Irish Ambassador and some of the most eminent historians in this field. So I'm very sorry that you're having to put up with a reserve from the subs bench rather than the star fly half. And I have to say, given what Dame Athene was just quoting from the book on the Troubles by Tim Pat Coogan, that Tim Pat Coogan's description of my role was about as accurate as his spelling of my name. I must also offer particular apologies to the future master of Peterhouse, my old friend Bridget Kendall, who told me 2 days ago that she was greatly looking forward to hearing me speak this evening about Russia. Sir John is doing very well with his new hip, and he much regrets that he cannot be here this evening. He has a great affection for Churchill College, for the outstanding Archives Centre, to which he has, of course, now sent his papers, and for the college's fine achievements in modern history. And Captain Stephen Roskill made a shining contribution to that historical record in the college's early years. Roskill was and still is, 34 years after his death, our best-known naval historian. It's a great pleasure to see members of his family here this evening, and an unexpected and undeserved honour for me to be asked to speak in his memory. I want to start with history and then just offer a few thoughts on the 1990s peace process. Gladstone once said, "Just when you begin to understand the Irish question, they change the question." The history of that question was, and perhaps remains, the biggest obstacle to peace. The Irish know their own history too well. The English don't know Irish history nearly well enough. In a lecture for Liverpool University's Institute of Irish Studies in 1996, the late Sir George Quigley, the far-sighted Northern Ireland businessman and public servant, observed that we are a long way from having any sense of shared community in Northern Ireland. Our divided history precludes us from deriving it from an emotionally shared past. And in that same lecture series, Senator George Mitchell said that his negotiations in Northern Ireland had been the longest and the most difficult that he had ever been involved with. Now, why? Why was it so hard to broker any movement in the negotiations with the parties in Northern Ireland? In most negotiations, there is a stronger side, a majority, which can ultimately be persuaded to give ground. But in Northern Ireland, we were dealing with two minorities, with the nationalist and Catholic minority within the north and the unionist and Protestant, or largely Protestant, minority within the island of Ireland as a whole, and each of those minorities felt threatened. This is what the journalist Harold Jackson, writing in 1971, called the double minority model. Each minority was determined to defend every last inch of historical turf, and they reminded me of the old Russian anecdote of the dirt-poor but pious peasant who was offered one wish by the archangel, and he looked across at the paddock of his very wealthy neighbour, who made his money by selling milk to the entire village, and the peasant uttered his wish, "May my neighbour's cow die." That, of course, is also an explanation of Putin's policy in Ukraine at the moment, but we won't go into that. The long history of sectarian competition in Northern Ireland had bred a zero-sum mentality. And by the 1990s, the leading figures in Northern Ireland politics had been engaged in the troubles for close to a quarter of a century. There was no new generation. Each was dug into a deeply entrenched position. Each carried into any discussion a groaning backpack of historical baggage, and getting the pack off the back was never a simple matter. Between the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland, however, the situation was very different. The cast of leaders had changed, not once, but several times. And if the title of this lecture implies that we had to overcome enmity, it is wrong. We had to overcome the legacy of partition, a legacy which was still, in the 1990s, the period I'm talking about, reflected in Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution. When countries separate, it takes generations for attitudes to change and relations to rebalance. Look at India and Pakistan. Look at Russia and Ukraine. Look at so many of the conflicts in the Middle East and Africa. And over this period, since partition, the United Kingdom and Ireland have had their ups and downs, their grievances, and at times we could have been better friends. Our history might have been different if Taoiseach John Costello had not taken Ireland out of the Commonwealth in 1948 and launched an onslaught on partition, which in turn triggered a sectarian response in the north and the cry of "No surrender, we are king's men" in the 1949 election in Northern Ireland. Despite that, and very interestingly, the Attlee government reacted with generosity, giving the nationals of the newly proclaimed Irish Republic full citizenship rights, including the vote, if they chose to live in the UK, as so many have done over the years. Nevertheless, despite our closeness, despite our shared cultures, our huge trade, our common membership of the European Union since 1973, despite the misnamed Anglo-Irish Agreement, that's not politically correct anymore, of 1985, Northern Ireland, until recently, stood as a very sharp issue between us, between the UK and the Republic. And of course, within the Republic of Ireland, there is no shortage of historical grievances, as we shall be reminded at the centenary of the Easter Rising later this month, the subject of the conference that is taking place here now. But I think the British also have been slow to appreciate changing attitudes in the Republic, slow to understand the old quip. How do you terrify a Dublin politician? You tell him that the North has decided to join the South. The vision that Republicans and nationalists have of a united Ireland is not irrational or illegitimate. As a vision, it is not of itself a threat to Northern Ireland, still less to the United Kingdom. And there are many different ways in which Ireland could become more united, I think probably will become more united over time. And there are many ways in which Ireland is united now, whether through Tourism Ireland or the rugby team. They don't all have to involve a change to the border. But what matters is how that vision is promoted, whether through violence or threats, or through consent and mutual benefit. Fianna Fáil remains an avowedly Republican party, but it is a party which now stands for constitutional republicanism, for the Good Friday Agreement, which was signed by a Fianna Fáil Prime Minister, Fianna Fáil Taoiseach, and for the principle of consent. So let me turn now from history to the peace process, more recent history. In a way, it started as far back as 1969. It started really when the Troubles began. And it has yet to finish. But I'm just going to pick out a few of the things that I personally observed from the worm's eye view of a Downing Street functionary in the early 1990s. Seamus Mallon, the former deputy leader of the SDLP in Northern Ireland, famously described the peace process as Sunningdale for slow learners. Why did the process move forward in the 1990s, where previous initiatives on broadly similar lines from Ted Heath's 1973 Sunningdale Agreement onwards had failed? The first reason that I would suggest is very obvious and very simple. It was that the conflict had become a stalemate. In the words of the former Irish Senator Maurice Hayes, the war had become both unwinnable and unlosable by both sides. We can see that now with hindsight. With hindsight, we can see that it had reached the Shakespearean point where there is a tide in the affairs of men which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. The security forces, the RUC and the Army, much assisted by the intelligence services and also benefiting from a vastly improved cooperation across the border with the Garda, had achieved a large measure of control. Lessons had been learnt from mistakes made early in the Troubles. But control came at a heavy cost. Nearly 800 military personnel and 300 RUC officers were killed during the Troubles. Among a population of 1.5 million, the RUC and the Army were having to deploy around 40,000 police and soldiers. Security measures alone were not going to eradicate violence. On the other side, by the early 1990s, it had become obvious to at least some in the leadership of the Provisional IRA that they could not win. They were never going to achieve their aims by terrorism. Living as a fugitive and in fear cannot be a lot of fun. There were attractions for them in a legitimate existence in the political arena. Moreover, it was no longer a conflict between two sides. The loyalist paramilitaries had become more aggressive and more effective and had begun to take a significant toll of Republicans, as well as increasing the complications for the security forces. And so it was against this background that in February 1993, soon after I'd started working for John Major, a message reached Downing Street through intelligence channels, apparently from the Provisional Army Council, which began, "The conflict is over, but we need your advice on how to bring it to a close." At that point, I think a common perception of deadlock had created an opportunity. Before I go forward with that opportunity, I want to step back a bit. The opportunity had arisen after years of work from the bottom up. It's political talks that take the headlines, but in a sectarian or ethnic conflict over finite territory, there can never be a perfect agreement which satisfies all. As Professor Richard Rose once observed of Northern Ireland, the problem is there's no solution. And of course, much the same could be said of other problems like Palestine. In Northern Ireland, the bottom up was as important as the top down. In the words of Richard Needham, who was the longest serving minister in the Northern Ireland office under direct rule, the third arm of the British government's strategy was the little-known story of the economic and social war against violence. The aim in that war was to provide hope, to drain support for violence by showing that there was a real alternative of a peaceful and more prosperous life for all sections of the community, and thereby to make politics the continuation of conflict by other means. And that meant job creation. It meant attracting investment, developing infrastructure and public services, including an education system which has produced the best A-level results in the whole of the United Kingdom. It meant extra funding from the Treasury well above what was due from the regional block grant. And it meant particularly important legislation on civil and political rights, on fair housing and fair employment, the first such law having in fact been passed by Brian Faulkner through Stormont in 1971. All of this, over a period of years, had an effect. As the peace process developed in the 90s, it benefited from enormous support from ordinary people, people desperate for an end to the violence. Some of them had been working courageously for years in local organizations. Some just came out onto the streets. They put pressure on the paramilitaries. They withdrew, in many communities, support from violence. They also had a hugely encouraging effect on the politicians. John Major was never going to gain any votes in Northern Ireland. I remember John Smith saying to him during a briefing on the peace process that he was entirely happy for the Labour Party to support it, which it did in a very bipartisan way, because there were no votes in Northern Ireland. But John Major was lifted by the encounters he had with ordinary people there, and I vividly remember the 21st of December 1995. That was his 13th visit to the province. He went there more often than any other British Prime Minister, at a time when the ceasefire was under threat. The day began in the company of enthusiastic nationalists in Belfast. Major was then mobbed on a walkabout in deeply unionist Ballymena with the local MP at his side, one Dr. Ian Paisley. And then he ended the day in Dublin, and there the Taoiseach, by now John Bruton, took his guest to a performance of The Messiah in the city where the oratorio was first heard. The audience rose in applause as the two prime ministers entered, and at the end they rose again, and they clapped them down the stairs and out of the theatre. And that wasn't something that happened a great deal in England. It showed that in three very different constituencies, in three different parts of Ireland, there was huge support for what the politicians were trying to do, and that massively encouraged them. My third element is the willingness to take political risks. Without that willingness, the process simply could not have advanced. And if I focus on the risks that I personally witnessed, and particularly on the 1993 Downing Street Declaration, it is not to diminish the risks taken by many others. It's too big a story for a single lecture. In 1990, Peter Brook, as Secretary of State, had taken the risk of reopening a secret channel of communication to the leadership of the Provisional IRA and of declaring, very controversially, in his Whitbread speech, that Britain had, I quote, no selfish, strategic or economic interest in Northern Ireland. And of course, selfish is a key word in that phrase. In March 1991, Brooke launched new talks with the four constitutional parties and the Irish government. The process had three strands: political development within Northern Ireland, the relationship between the north and the south of Ireland, and the relationship between the United Kingdom and the Republic. This complex three-stranded process was then taken over by Sir Patrick Mayhew, Brooke's successor. It became the train which the provisionals and the loyalist paramilitaries were invited to join. Brooke and Mayhew had both declared in public that Sinn Féin's inclusion in talks would become possible if the violence ceased. For 7 years, that train ran over hill and dale. It was frequently derailed. At times, it got stuck in a siding. It ran through the Joint Framework Document of 1995, which was rejected by the Unionists, the Issues Paper, the building blocks, the twin-track process, before it finally reached its destination in 1998, with by now Tony Blair and Mo Mowlam in the driving cab in the Good Friday Agreement. Now, the task we had was to get Sinn Féin onto this train without the Unionists jumping off on the other side. And in 1993, John Major, when this message arrived that I talked about earlier, took a risk which could have ended his premiership after less than 3 years. After much agonized debate within a very small circle of ministers and advisers, he decided to authorize a response to the message from the provisionals which had said that the conflict was over. Some argued that this was a trap, that there were powerful elements in the IRA which could never be reconciled. But Major judged that it was right to test the IRA's position and see if it could be nudged forward. Now, the authenticity of that message has since been disputed. There are all sorts of versions that have been put forward, and different versions are around. But this is beside the point. The message led to a short series of exchanges which became one of the precursors to the eventual negotiations. The risk for the government, and indeed the risk also for Martin McGuinness and Gerry Adams, to whom credit is due, was laid bare when the messages were leaked to the press late in 1993. The British government had set out its position in these messages in a way that was completely consistent with its public stance. It had not offered any secret deals, but it was accused of negotiating with terrorists who had not given up violence. And this almost forced the resignation of the Northern Ireland Secretary, Sir Patrick Mayhew. He was saved, quite rightly, by his very high reputation for integrity. John Major's second risk was to engage in talks with his Irish counterpart, Albert Reynolds, about a joint declaration. That was an idea that was viewed with the deepest suspicion by Unionists and their supporters in the Conservative Party, in part because it was seen to have originated in John Hume's talks with Gerry Adams since 1988, and in part because of historical Unionist fears that any involvement of Dublin would be the thin end of the wedge. It had been Unionist and Loyalist opposition which in 1974 had brought down the power-sharing executive set up after Sunningdale. That opposition had focused particularly on the Council of Ireland, a purely consultative body proposed in the Sunningdale Agreement. And it had again been the Unionists who came out in huge numbers against Margaret Thatcher's 1985 Anglo-Irish Agreement with Garret Fitzgerald, an agreement which included within it a proposal, indeed it became a reality, for an Anglo-Irish intergovernmental conference, again of a purely consultative kind, with a small joint secretariat at Maryfield. And the Unionists opposed that agreement, opposed Dublin's involvement, despite the fact that the agreement was also opposed by Sinn Féin and by Fianna Fáil, and also by one Jeremy Corbyn MP, as constituting formal recognition of partition and British jurisdiction in Northern Ireland. These agreements have been described as building blocks for the peace process, which in a sense they were. But they were also roadblocks. They left a legacy of Unionist opposition to cross-border talks, which John Major and Patrick Mayhew had to overcome. Major had agreed with Charles Hockey in 1991 that the two prime ministers should meet every 6 months. But the personal relationship with the Taoiseach really developed after Albert Reynolds took over in February 1992. Now, Major and Reynolds were interesting to observe because they were completely dissimilar characters. Major was and is a ferocious autodidact who always insisted on doing his homework. He wanted to go into any negotiation feeling that he knew more than the person across the table. Reynolds was the opposite. He was loquacious and emotional. He'd spent most of his life as an entrepreneur, running businesses from dance halls to pet foods. He worked off the cuff, by instinct. His staff had a mantra. Albert's a bottom line man, they used to say to me. He was endlessly looking for a deal. But there was one interesting thing that connected them. They were both outsiders. One from Brixton, one from remote Roskill in the middle of Ireland. Both had risen on their abilities from humble origins. Neither had been to university, neither was part of the establishment. Before the dance halls, Reynolds had started in clerical work, so did John Major. Political opponents derided Reynolds as a country bumpkin, and some of his officials made fun of his lack of education. These two outsiders had bonded as finance ministers in the late 1980s. As leaders, they both saw and both were determined to seize the opportunity to change the situation. They were both prepared to take very substantial risks with their domestic politics. That said, negotiating the declaration was no easy process. There were times when tempers rose, times when John Major snapped his pencil, as he reminded me this afternoon. With each version of the text, Reynolds would declare that he couldn't budge another inch. If Major didn't agree, he would be responsible for missing a historic chance for peace. And then he would hype up expectations through the press. When Major, on one occasion, responded to this by sending a new British draft of the joint declaration to the Taoiseach in November 1993 in order to demonstrate what he could and what he could not accept, Reynolds was furious, and I know that because I was the unfortunate bearer of the message, and I was battered by a Taoiseach, made all the more angry by being kept waiting in his office late on a Friday evening after I'd missed my flight. But the deal was done, and the deal was largely done in 7 grinding hours of talks in Dublin Castle on the 3rd of December 1993. Now, that summit meeting began with the angriest conversation between two leaders that I ever witnessed. Major and Reynolds went into a room together and they shut the rest of us outside. They were bristling for a fight. Major slammed down a sheaf of press cuttings, which had inflamed opinion in the North and the UK, with the fingerprints of the Taoiseach all over them, as he had tried to sell the deal to his domestic audience and put pressure on the British. Reynolds, in turn, tore into Major for using a back channel to the provisionals, not that Dublin didn't have a much more active channel of its own. And no one sitting outside that door and hearing the shouting could have imagined that the two men inside were friends who would pull off a historic agreement a mere 12 days later. But the catharsis worked, trust was re-established, and their friendship remained through and beyond the end of Reynolds' premiership in November 1994. Indeed, John Major visited Albert Reynolds and his family in Dublin a few months before Reynolds died in 2014 and attended his funeral. He was said to have been the last politician to visit Reynolds. After Reynolds, John Major enjoyed another close working partnership with John Bruton, as then did Tony Blair with Bertie Ahern. And it was this sustained collaboration between successive prime ministers and Taoiseachs that was absolutely critical to the process. Now, I want to talk with a little fortification about another risk taker, perhaps a surprising one, the low visibility Ulster Unionist Party leader James Molyneux. Major constantly warned Dublin that the joint declaration would fail like its predecessors if the Unionists came out against it. He warned that it was completely erroneous for them to think that the British government could deliver the Unionists while Dublin delivered the nationalists. The declaration had to spell out that the status of the North could not be changed without the consent of the people of the North. It had to address the need to change the Irish constitution, and Major adamantly rejected the suggestion in early drafts that the British government could become persuaders for a united Ireland. That was a position, indeed, which the British Labour Party had adopted in 1981, and from which Tony Blair was later to unhook it. It would have guaranteed Unionist rejection. It was already certain that Ian Paisley and the DUP would reject the declaration. And despite that, Major always made a point of giving Paisley a hearing whenever he requested one, and their personal relations were surprisingly friendly, although they had some epic meetings, in one of which Major walked out of the cabinet room when Paisley refused to apologise for calling him a liar, and Paisley sat in the cabinet room with Peter Robinson and Nigel Dobbs, and for 15 minutes read out his prepared submission to an empty room while I sat outside the door before ushering him out of the building. So that was a curious relationship. I was then accused by Paisley of having locked him in the lavatory, which wasn't actually true. The crucial position over the declaration was the stance of the Ulster Unionist Party, who were then in the majority. Now, in 1985, they had not been consulted on the Anglo-Irish Declaration, and Jim Molyneux, still their leader then, had lined up with Paisley in a joint call to action against what they called a blueprint for an all-Ireland. And they'd effectively refused to cooperate with it ever since. Major knew that Molyneux could not afford to be seen to be in open consultation with him on the draft declaration. Molyneux would have had to have taken the text back to his colleagues. They would have shot it down and probably leaked the worst parts of it to the press. That would have killed it. So instead, Major held private meetings with Molyneux to keep him abreast of the process and test out language without, and this was by mutual consent, ever handing over text. So Molyneux could say he had never had the document. And they developed what we called a non-expostulation test, a useful device as an addition to diplomacy. If a passage was read to Jim Molyneux without Jim expostulating, we could reckon that the UUP could live with it. And indeed, James Molyneux was as good as his word. Ian Paisley denounced the text before he had even read it. Molyneux came under heavy pressure to do likewise, but he held his party in line. He eventually steered them towards it. They ended up quoting from it. And that was brave leadership. He used up his political capital to make peace, just as David Trimble was to do at a later stage of the process after the Good Friday Agreement. The Downing Street Declaration of 15 December 1993 led eventually, after 8 months, to paramilitary ceasefires in the autumn of 1994, and then to over a year of peace, but of increasingly fraught negotiation with Sinn Féin before the IRA reverted to violence in February 1996. And before I conclude, I think I should say something about the way that the ceasefire ended. One version of why it broke down is that the British government, allegedly now dependent on the Unionists for its survival, for its Commons majority, had misled Sinn Féin and deliberately delayed Sinn Féin's entry into all-party talks by introducing a new and impossible precondition in Sir Patrick Mayhew's Washington statement of the 7th of March 1995. Mayhew had said in Washington that there must be a willingness in principle to disarm progressively. There must be agreement on how this was to be done and a start to the process as a tangible confidence-building measure. This was represented, or rather grossly misrepresented, as a demand that the IRA should make a humiliating surrender of its weapons before entering talks. It was, of course, nothing of the kind, and indeed, ironically, Mayhew's position was attacked by the Unionists as a capitulation to the IRA. Let me just give the Downing Street view of decommissioning and why it was important. Self-evidently, possession of unlicensed arms and explosives is not compatible with the democratic process. The IRA had not declared a permanent end to their armed struggle, merely a ceasefire. their paramilitary organisation remained very actively in being, carrying out so-called punishment beatings and reconnoitring targets. Neither the British government nor the constitutional parties, and Seamus Mallon of the SDLP was as strong on decommissioning and is to this day as anyone, could tolerate a negotiation in which Sinn Féin could threaten a return to violence if it didn't get its way. The Unionists in particular were simply not going to sit down with Sinn Féin without some clearer evidence than the weasel words announcing the ceasefire, of a real commitment to a permanent end to the conflict. And as far as Mayhew's position of March 1995 was concerned, there was nothing new in it. Indeed, it was a rather mild and rather conciliatory statement of the position, as the Unionists themselves complained. The 1993 Downing Street Declaration had required a commitment to exclusively peaceful methods. And on the day following, the Irish Deputy Prime Minister, Dick Spring, had told the Dáil, "We are talking about the handing up of arms and are insisting that it will not be simply a temporary cessation of violence. There can be no equivocation in relation to the determination of both governments in that regard." And indeed, Spring later repeated that there will have to be a verification of the handing over of arms. John Major made the same point in public and in private, including to John Hume. Decommissioning was clearly on the agenda. It was on the agenda of the preliminary talks which were taking place with Sinn Féin after the ceasefire started and with the loyalist paramilitary representatives. How and in what circumstances decommissioning was to take place, and this is not surrender, was a matter for discussion. Or it would have been if Sinn Féin had agreed to discuss it, which they adamantly refused to do. Indeed, any papers on the subject that were presented to them, they simply left on the table. The British and Irish governments worked very hard together on how decommissioning could be achieved in a way that could be sold, and this led to the announcement in December 1995 by John Major and John Bruton of the International Decommissioning Commission under George Mitchell. Unfortunately, that commission came too late. By then, as we now know, the IRA had already decided to end their ceasefire. I'm in no doubt at all that the need for decommissioning was well understood by the leaders of the provisionals, and indeed Martin McGuinness on one occasion reportedly told one of Albert Reynolds's officials that "we know the guns will have to be banjaxed," not a word I could have made up. The fundamental problem here was that the provisionals were split. The Canary Wharf attack and the bombings which followed showed that the Sinn Féin leadership did not at that time have sufficient control to carry the whole Republican movement into the democratic process. And the bombings proved the need for progress towards decommissioning. It was thanks to the patient and heroic efforts of George Mitchell, in his case over 6 years, and of General John de Chastelain, that this eventually happened, eventually completed in 2005. It took time. Tragically, the end of the ceasefire cost more lives. But without this success over decommissioning, the process simply could not have moved forward. So let me now conclude. I think that any notion of enmity between Britain and Ireland was put way, way into the past when the Queen was welcomed into the Republic in 2011. By then, she had made no fewer than 107 state visits, and it is remarkable that until then, she had not been able to pay a state visit to our closest neighbour. But then she did. And then President Higgins came here 2 years ago on a reciprocal state visit. 89 years from partition, we had reached what Enda Kenny called the conclusion of centuries of division. Our relations had at last just become normal. I also believe that the notion of enmity between the Republic and the majority community in the North is on the way out. It's never applied to a great many individuals within that community anyway. Historical fears are being laid to rest. I do not believe that the conflict in Northern Ireland will ever resume in its previous form. There are, of course, still small groups of irreconcilables who are prepared to use criminal violence for criminal ends and using descriptions of themselves as real or some other form of IRA. There are still acute tensions around power sharing. The political process since the Good Friday Agreement has been very erratic and fairly unstable. But nearly 2 decades without armed struggle, 2 decades of relative peace, have had a transformative effect. And if you want to see it, although I've not been there recently, go to the city of Newry, on the borders of the North and the Republic, and also the border within Northern Ireland between South Armagh and County Down. Newry was an IRA stronghold. One of the remarkable events of 1995 was seeing John Major able to walk the streets of Newry, unthinkable to previous British Prime Ministers, to the warmest of greetings from ordinary people. Now, since peace came, Newry has flourished as a centre not of terrorism, but of cross-border trade. Between 1996 and 2006, house prices in Newry rose more rapidly than in any other town in the United Kingdom, by some 371%. Unemployment fell from 26% in 1991 to 2% in 2005. But peace has yet to bridge the divide between the communities in Northern Ireland. As Sir George Quigley observed, the Good Friday Agreement required enforced fraternity at the top, while there was a serious lack of fraternity at the base. The Troubles caused a massive population movement. They drove mixed communities apart, and the process of segregation has continued since 1998. They have not come back together. New peace walls, indeed, have been built between communities even since then. And over 90% of the pupils in Northern Ireland are still in denominational schools. Having led the Ulster Unionists towards partition in a highly confrontational way, Sir Edward Carson, about whom you're no doubt conferring separately during your conference, in 1921 called on the future Parliament of Northern Ireland to show a tolerance, a fairness, and a justice towards all classes and toward all religions of the community. They must forget faction and section. Now, sadly, that precept was not followed. The peace process is far from over, and it will not have succeeded while sectarianism remains. The desegregation of Northern Ireland cannot be done from outside. It isn't going to happen top down. It is really a slow and challenging task for the people of the North over the next generation. But I believe that in conditions of peace, it is doable. Thank you very much.